When it comes to playing video games, there's always going to be a number of useful ideas which accumulate as they're discovered while making progress in a playthrough. The sort of information that I wish I knew from the beginning so my gameplay experience would have been enhanced. Nevertheless, in the spirit of sharing hindsight data, we're going to discuss a handful of them that you'll definitely want to know, just in case you're new to KCD2 or perhaps planning to play it in the near future. In a way, this is a continuation of another preparatory video where we assembled a free starter equipment set that are readily available after the prologue. I'll leave a link to this down in the description so you can check it out afterwards if necessary. Okay, let's begin. The most important one we need to address right away pertains to a combat bug that, as of version 1.3.2, still exists. You see, when a fight begins and after drawing Henry's weapon, nothing happens initially when the attack button is pressed, almost as if we have to nudge it awake first. This issue is not isolated to melee combat, because the same thing can be noticed during fist fights and even while fighting on horseback. I first talked about this in a short video, and according to player feedback, it mainly affects controller users on PC, which seems to be true, because when I did a test using 3 different joysticks, one from Xbox and 2 third-party units from different brands, the bug still persists. But when I switched to a mouse and keyboard, it went away. Now, if you're one of those affected by such combat behavior, it's highly suggested to tap the attack button once before engaging an enemy. This is very important, especially if you like to begin your offense with a master strike. Otherwise, Henry might get caught by an incoming blow. Speaking of accidentally absorbing melee attacks, the addition of belts to character gear is a welcome feature, since it allows us to equip multiple weapons and quickly switch between them. But if there's one thing we need to keep in mind at all times, it's that a melee weapon should always be on standby. This is such a simple thing that should go without saying, but it can also cause a lot of trouble if we forget to do so. For example, there was one instance where I spent some time shooting down nests, and after going on my way, some bandits were spotted on the road whom I decided to fight. Unfortunately, because I neglected to do an arms check, Henry pulled out his bow that was used earlier while facing the brigands at close range. This is a sticky scenario to be in because our character can't block or dodge while wielding a ranged weapon. And getting hit during this vulnerable situation means he'll have to absorb the attacks until an opening can be found. When this happens, our only means of defense would be to jump while moving backwards, which does work quite well if timed correctly. And from here, there are 2 things we can do. In the middle of a jump animation, that moment can be used to quickly retrieve our melee weapon, but it's most likely we'll still have to endure 1 or 2 hits before Henry can defend himself. The other option would be to use that same window so our character can turn around and sprint away momentarily as he swaps out his bow. This is safer than the previous method since it gives ample time for switching, although we must be prepared to defend immediately once Henry turns around. Of course, it would be best if we could avoid this scenario in the first place. So every time we're done using a bow, crossbow, or a firearm, it's good practice to check our belt afterwards and make sure that a melee weapon is always at the ready. Also, the one on standby is separate per equipment set, even if we have the same gear across all of them. So it's entirely possible to have a sword for quick draw in Group 1, but not for the others. In relation to this, sometimes it's hard to anticipate if Henry would be getting into a fight or not while doing quests. There are moments when an objective may start out just talking to an NPC, so we might choose to don high charisma clothing, but then a fight may break out afterwards. And since we're not allowed to switch equipment during hostile encounters, Henry would be left without any defensive gear. This is why when it comes to assembling a set of fancy garments, I consider coats to be the most important piece, especially those with high charisma, like this red fitted coat, for example, that has a score of 30. Since it's the outermost clothing for Henry's upper body, we can easily bolster his defense underneath with a full set of gambeson, chainmail, and chestplate without negatively affecting his stat. With this kind of setup, our character should now be more protected in case a conversation turns into an armed encounter. Just a heads up, if you're planning on collecting every type of armor and clothing there is in KCD2, perhaps to give you the most options in customizing what Henry wears, it's worth pointing out that many of them have several variations, and sometimes these differences can be quite subtle. For example, I currently found 5 different looks for the fitted coat shown earlier, and they're easy to see if we check them out in our inventory. But these 2 spined kettle hats, on the other hand, look almost exactly identical, except one is slightly darker than the other. I pointed this out because equipment that would be added to our collection are sorted and stored in the item box where there's no preview, apart from a small thumbnail of what an object is supposed to look like. Therefore, it's possible to accidentally remove something that we might have thought to be an exact duplicate, but is actually a unique copy, so this is something we need to look out for. Once we've sorted out objects meant to be sold off, immediately disposing them is a good practice, because one of the changes to KCD2's economy is that traders can no longer increase their groschen on hand by selling our loot. In order to avoid a situation where our backpack and saddlebags gets filled to the brim because we've already exhausted the available groschen from merchants, get rid of unwanted items as soon as possible. This is especially applicable to the Trotsky region, since there are only a handful of NPCs here who are willing to buy stuff from Henry. Such a change is most likely done to slow down our character's acquisition of wealth, but thankfully there are multiple ways to make money in this game. Apart from conventional means, there's a lot to be made by selling unmanned horses left on the road, which happens on occasion when there are bandits causing trouble. Rather than letting these creatures go to waste, we might as well hand them over to Mikolai at the Roma camp and earn a chunk of change. However, it should be noted that only these ones are safe to mount and steal. An unattended horse somewhere around or near a village means its owner is probably in the vicinity, so these ones are off limits unless you're willing to risk it. As for other types of thievery, most of the things you need to know are already covered in the video dedicated to it, but there are 2 pieces of info I'd like to append. First is to not underestimate pickpocketing unnamed NPCs, because some of them carry mildly expensive stuff. For example, in Takov alone, there's a peasant and a hired hand who both carry a tin badge, among other things. Second, there's really nothing to worry about if the objects we stole gets confiscated by a guard after being searched, because just like in KCD1, it's still possible to swipe them back immediately after the sentry resumes his patrol. However you decide to make money in KCD2, I noticed that sometimes we can never really predict when our groschen will be put to use. While out traveling, we might run into a merchant who's selling some unique but pricey items, or perhaps Henry might get involved in a wager where the stake is higher than usual. So even though there are many things we'll have to spend our coin on in this game, setting aside a portion of it will be to our advantage.
You won't get me!
Recommended reserves is not limited to silver though, because having access to every potion available is also beneficial. Of course, all of Henry's capabilities that are covered by a concoction will be enhanced. In the Thievery video, for example, I explained why consuming a quick finger potion is essential for lockpicking, especially when the skill level is low. In addition, there's also something interesting going on with the drinking skill. You see, leveling this one through typical means is a very slow process, because Henry's tolerance for alcohol is directly tied to it. For example, he'll only be able to drink 1 skin of fine wine without getting too intoxicated at the beginning. However, chugging down Hair of the Dog potion essentially negates drunkenness, which means we can down any alcoholic drink there is, and as many as our nourishment stat will permit. In essence, we can temporarily use them to fill Henry's belly and fast-track his drinking skill as long as HD is active. Furthermore, without spoiling anything, certain potions get brought up as an alternative means of solving a problem during quests from time to time. Hence, at the start of a playthrough, it's highly recommended to prioritize alchemy first until we amass a collection of everything. Because just like with saving groschen, one can never tell when they'll come in handy. As for other sources of nourishment, obviously there's a lot to choose from, starting with food being sold in shops to those that we can hunt ourselves. But if you're like me who just wants to refill Henry's gas tank without much hassle, I highly recommend sticking with honey. Similar to dried food stuff, it also lasts indefinitely, but is much more filling. And unlike some types of food that can sap energy, such as beef for example, honey will instead replenish it by 1 point. Best of all, if you're okay with stealing them, many settlements have functioning beehives, where each group of pillars should contain a dozen or more units, which will be enough to sustain our character for a while. On the other hand, mutts cannot be fed with honey, so this is where dried food will be useful. And there used to be a problem where our dog would not eat if the bag rolls away, but nowadays this issue no longer persists, as long as they're not standing on a steep slope. Some lessons in KCD2 are just made to be learned the hard way, and one of the things I discovered early on is to not brute force our way through the Zhelyov Bridge if there's an oncoming caravan. I know it's annoying that we have to wait for them to cross first, but the time it would take to get Henry and Pebbles unstuck from doing so will be much longer. I've experienced this firsthand, thinking I could probably squeeze my way through, but it ended with having to reload a recent save file. Speaking of Pebbles, we know her initial stats are just not that great, and while she's adequate as a riding companion, the same thing cannot be said for mounted combat because her courage is too low. Every time we run into bandits on the road, it's almost always guaranteed that Henry would be thrown off if the brigands decide to attack, even if we already rode past them. So unless we're determined to fight on foot, it would be best to avoid hostiles completely until Pebbles' upgrade is unlocked. Another thing I learned eventually is how to deal with bird nests, which can be annoying to look for if it drops on some bushes. Now, an interesting thing about this activity is it doesn't matter how powerful the ranged weapon that will be used, because nests always drop just below the tree. Hence, it's not necessary to shoot them from far away at a shallow angle. And it would be best if we look around first for a clear patch of ground, then shoot it from underneath towards that direction for an easy retrieval afterwards. However, there will be trees out there that are seemingly surrounded by bushes everywhere. Since it's possible to anticipate where a nest would land, the best thing we can do after hitting it would be to immediately approach and look at the approximate drop-off point. If we move fast enough, we should be able to see exactly where the object would be. The same technique is applicable for trees situated on slopes. If possible, the nest should be struck away from it. But as long as we can see our target, retrieval afterwards should be a lot easier. For our last 2 pointers, I'll be sharing with you key pieces of info surrounding one main quest about a certain wedding that Henry must get to. Now by itself, this is something we'll know very early on, so it's not a spoiler. But before attending the said event, I highly recommend that you finish an entire questline related to the huntsmen of Trotsky region, because it will add an important context to the main storyline. Furthermore, we'll also find out that we can get to the wedding by working for blacksmith Radovan or Miller Krazel. Now what I suggest is to assist the blacksmith first, because at one point, he's going to ask Henry to forge a unique sword, and it's something you might want to keep for yourself. Not only is it a sole copy that exists, there's also something peculiar going on, because it's technically classified as a short sword, and Henry does wield it like one, but the weapon length and damage is clearly that of a longsword. When I tested this out, I've confirmed that we can indeed hang on to it after forging, and get to the wedding with Miller Krazel's help instead. By the looks of it, the developers anticipated such a possibility, because the weapon doesn't disappear from our pack, and there's actually a small objective that opens up if we present it to Radovan after that main quest. I will leave the decision up to you if this sword is worth keeping, but for now, these are the gameplay tips I wish I knew right away that hopefully can be put to good use.